said, I'm a research scientist and climate adaptation specialist with the Climate Impacts Group. And I want to explore both what the expected changes in our climate are that we'll be experiencing here in Washington State, and begin to introduce this topic and talk about what is planning for climate resilience as it relates to water systems. And we'll be talking about this in general. Most of what I say applies to all different sizes and types of water systems throughout the state. But we do really want to organize or sort of gear this workshop around the smaller water systems in the region, and give you an opportunity to talk about the issues and the impacts that you're experiencing, and hopefully make this information as relevant as possible to those systems. So the Climate Impacts Group is a organization within the University of Washington. Our goal is to work with decision makers and to make information about climate science information useful and relevant to the decisions that people are making, and particularly with the goal of helping people plan and prepare for the impacts of climate change. And we're certainly experiencing a lot of climate-related events throughout the state. I pulled just a couple of quick headlines of some of the things that we have been experiencing recently. So 2021 being a drought across much of the Northwest region. Also the extreme heat wave in June, some record temperatures that people were experiencing. Wildfire has increased over the last 30 years throughout Washington State, and many water systems have experienced different impacts related to that, both on water supply and infrastructure. So this is something that we're all feeling, and I think that we're all feeling what I call climate whiplash as well. I think that's something that's been particularly significant in the last year, where we go from the drought and wildfire season that we had this past summer into what we're experiencing this fall and winter with the atmospheric rivers, extreme precipitation events such as the one that we're in right now. So I feel like this is, really present in our current experience, and this is a good opportunity to have discussions about these impacts and how they relate to climate change. So I often start my presentations with this reminder that climate matters, right? Why do we care about climate? It's because so much of the systems that we depend on in Washington State are built with assumptions about the climate. The way that our bridges are built, the way that our water systems are designed, the way that our roads, the standards to which our roads are built, all of those infrastructure decisions or planning or management decisions have assumptions about the climate built into them. Whether we realize that or not, we're assuming that the climate of the past is our climate. And this is sort of the fundamental thing that we are encouraging people to think about when they think about climate resilience, is recognizing how much of the way that we live here in the Northwest, how much climate is important to our economies, to our way of life. And what climate change does is it forces us to take a look at those assumptions about climate. So what we're going to be talking about today is planning for climate resilience. And I want to start off by saying there's nothing magical or drastically different about planning for climate resilience compared to the other types of planning that we do. Many of you may be engaged in different types of planning, such as emergency response, or are aware of Growth Management Act planning. There's lots of different planning that we do within the state, and climate resilience planning in many ways is no different from that. The key difference and the most important thing is to recognize that the climate of the past is no longer a predictor of the future. We can still use past events, past experience, the past record of climate as an indicator. But the most fundamental thing about climate resilience planning is to recognize that the climate of the future is changing, that we're moving into potentially impacts that we haven't experienced before, temperatures above what we are used to planning and building to. And that if we only think about the climate of the past, or we only look at past natural hazards related to climate, then we will be insufficiently prepared for the future climate. And this can leave water systems at greater risk and affect the reliability of our drinking water system. And so climate resilience planning is not a wholesale change in what we're doing for the most part. Most systems can make small modifications, small changes in the way that they plan, the way that they build, the way that they get their resources in order to be able to accommodate these changes that we expect in the future. The main thing is just having a recognition of that in our planning processes. And so this figure here shows some of the different components of climate resilience planning, very similar to most planning processes. And what we're going to talk a fair amount about today is the assessment process, and particularly vulnerability assessment and understanding how your water system may be particularly vulnerable to some of the changes in the climate or natural hazards that we expect to be more frequent as the climate changes. So I want to start by describing where we're at. The climate in Washington state is changing. We've experienced about a 2-degree Fahrenheit increase in temperature during the 20th century. So that's the average annual temperature. And that's what's shown in this orange line here. This is our record of temperature for Washington state. And we see that it has really started to rise since about the 1970s. And we are certainly experiencing that temperature now in a number of different ways. And I think, you know, that it's also important to note that the variability in the rising temperature doesn't go away. But when we're talking about climate change, what we're talking about is this trend overall in the temperature on average over a long period of time. So we still will continue to have colder than average years or colder than average winters, but it's the overall trend in the temperature that we're talking about when we talk about climate change. Another example of this and what we've experienced so far is since 1986, all but 5 years have been above the long-term average. So more and more frequently, our years, our summers are above the average temperature that we've experienced in the past. And this change in the climate has a number of impacts throughout the state. We are experiencing some of those impacts in different ways across the region, from our mountains to our coasts. So we know that the snowpack is declining. We've had about a 30% decline in mountain snowpack since the middle of the century. We know that stream flows are also experiencing a decline in glacier runoff. That is particularly important to contributing to surface flows in the summertime when that snowpack is melted. We also know along the coasts, we're experiencing a number of impacts, such as sea level rise and more frequent coastal flooding. And there's a number of different changes to the hydrologic system throughout the state, and we'll talk about those in our different presentations today. So these are observed changes, changes in our climate and our natural systems that we are experiencing throughout the state today. And what I'm going to talk about now is what we expect for climate change in the future across our state. And I only have a few minutes here today, so I'm going to cover this in a very high level. I can't get into kind of the details, the specific numbers of a lot of these changes. What I want to show you here is that we at the Climate Impacts Group have a number of resources and documents. We also have several tools that allow you to access data about how things are changing. And everything that I'm going to cover today is included in these resources, and we can point you to those resources on our website. What I want to do now is give you an overview of what those changes are, and hopefully we'll have time to dig a little deeper into those today, or you can follow up in the future if you want specifics for your area or specific impacts that I'm going to talk about.
Just a quick 2-minute warning, Crystal.
Okay, great. So that's, I might just take a couple more minutes of time than Anam, so I'll try to get us back on track. So we know that there are multiple changes in the climate that we expect. So warming, more frequent heat waves, sea levels are expected to continue to rise with more coastal flooding. and a number of impacts to our hydrologic system, drier summers and more frequent droughts. This list that I'm showing here, we can consider to be the most certain impacts, the ones that we have the most confidence, and will be, kind of consistent changes across the state. There's also a set of impacts where we expect these to occur, and there's maybe a little bit less uncertainty about exactly how they're going to play out in different areas. Lower stream flows, higher winter flow, changes in extreme natural hazards like wildland fire, wetter winters, and heavier rainfall. So we know that these are going to play out to a different extent in different parts of the state, and we also know that a lot about your system, your resources will determine how these sorts of impacts actually affect your system and what sorts of consequences you experience due to them. And so I think in the interest of time, I'm going to skip through a couple of slides here that talks about these different impacts, since I've covered them in general. And what I want to, I think I'm going to shift now to talk a little bit about the changes that we expect to most affect surface water supply. So a number of you talked about surface water being your source of water. We will have presentations also talking about groundwater. And we know obviously that surface water and groundwater are connected. So one of the main impacts and one of the most certain impacts of climate change for Washington State is a decrease in snowpack. And so this is kind of a map showing our historical April 1st snowpack throughout Washington State. And this is a map showing where we expect those changes to be most pronounced. So warmer temperatures will decrease winter snowpack. And we expect that to really emerge first at the lower elevations, our foothills of the Cascades and Olympic Mountains. And as climate continues to warm, also seeing higher elevations start to lose the snowpack. By the middle of the century, we're talking about a 45 to 50% decrease in that spring snowpack. We also expect this to have significant impacts on stream flow. And there's a number of changes to stream flow, and how these will play out may vary in different areas. But the most sort of noticeable and impactful change is change in the timing of stream flow. So we expect to see earlier snow melt that shifts the spring peak earlier. Because with warmer temperatures, we expect more precipitation as rain in the winter. Then we will see a higher stream flow in the winter time and lower summer stream flow. Again, that lower summer stream flow coming because we have a smaller amount of snowpack melting, that snow melt running off earlier, and also because of warmer temperatures in the summertime and potentially decreases in summer precipitation. So this is just an example of the Entiat River kind of showing you that change through time. The blue shaded area being 2020s, and you start to see that shift in our stream flow and what it looks like throughout the year, increases in the winter flows, decreases in the summer flows. And by the 2080s, seeing pretty dramatic changes in our stream flow, where in this example, having a stream that typically had a peak in its runoff, highest stream flows occurring in the spring months, we still see that, but then we also see this large peak in the winter months as well. And associated with those changes, there are other implications with an increase in the amount of peak flows or flooding. Just an example from the Puget Sound region. The 12 largest rivers in the Puget Sound region expected to experience a 20 to 50% increase in those peak flows. And then also sea level rise is another impact that I want to mention for our coastal water systems, where there's a number of possible impacts associated with that, not just more frequent coastal flooding and actual rising of that coastal water level, but also the potential for saltwater intrusion or erosion of bluffs along the coast. So that's kind of a high level overview of how we expect the climate, natural hazards, and our hydrologic system to change. There are a number of potential impacts to the water systems, including increasing demand, changing in particularly the timing of supply, potential damage to infrastructure, reductions in water quality and reliability, which we'll be touching on in different presentations today. And all this can result in higher operating costs for systems. So the point that I want to make here is how any of these impacts play out depends on the specifics of your system. We can tell you the general expected changes in the climate, But whether or not your system is sensitive or will be directly impacted by those changes often depends a lot on your own systems and the qualities of those systems in terms of where you get your water from, the different aspects of the infrastructure. And so that's what we're going to explore today as well. We're going to be talking about the different components of climate vulnerability. So I really quickly want to touch on those. So most of what I've talked about here today kind of falls within this realm of exposure. So that's how fast the climate is changing, what is changing, how it's going to change in your area. We're also going to talk about the sensitivity. That's about just the inherent qualities of your system. How do you operate? What's the condition of your infrastructure? Are there multiple stressors or other factors that are also affecting things like water supply and water demand? And then we'll talk a little bit about the capacity. What are the resources that you have, the human capacity, the financial capacity of your systems, and that can also affect the extent to which you're vulnerable to climate change. So the key sort of message that I want to leave you with is that we expect to see a number of impacts associated with climate change or global warming, and how much that really affects us, affects the reliability, the safety, the quality of our drinking water. Really depends on the actions that we take today. We can do something about these impacts that are coming in the way that we plan and manage our systems. And whether or not these sorts of changes in the climate actually translate to impacts on reliability or water quality depends on the extent to which we plan and prepare. And we are making decisions in our planning decisions and our infrastructure decisions, how we choose to build. We're making decisions every day that depend on the climate. And those are the decisions where we have an opportunity to consider the climate of the future and not just depend on what we've experienced thus far in terms of natural hazards or climate impacts. So hopefully.
I'm here today in order to demonstrate to you that, clearly demonstrated by most of the answers that we just got in that poll, you already have all the tools in place necessary in order to take in this new information about climate change and make positive change for your community. So let's get right into it. So in public health, our approach is called the multiple barriers approach. That is, when there's a problem that could affect public health, we usually don't look for that one thing that solves the whole thing. What we do is we add in a whole bunch of different barriers to that problem so that it can't make it all the way to harming people. We do this in areas outside of public health as well. So like here, this list of transportation interventions that we have in order to make transportation safer. So we have driver's education and driver's licenses to make sure that people are trained before they go out on the road. There are rules that we are all following. And then there are traffic lights and speed limits in order to try to alter behavior once people have already gotten onto the roads. And then in those places where there's potential conflicts between vehicles, we have traffic barriers, we have traffic calming in order to try to make sure that there are fewer opportunities to have conflicts or high-speed conflicts. But even through all of these, we then also have part of the vehicle itself is that there are crumple zones, and we've got seat belts and airbags. And then if all of these things have failed to prevent the emergency, then we have emergency rescue, people who will come and try to help you when that accident, that crash actually occurs. But you see, they all build on each other. That is, if the driver's education didn't work, then the traffic lights will tell them. And if the traffic lights didn't help, then the barriers will help. And if the barriers didn't help, then the car tried to protect you. And then you see how that all fits together. We do the same thing for water systems, and you know this. We have certified operators who know what they're doing and professional development in order to make sure that it's being operated professionally. We have engineering standards, O&M manuals, financial control systems, ways in which we operate in a standard way in order to make sure that we're following these rules. We have sanitary surveys, people coming in order to help you identify problems in your water system, consumer confidence reports to let the public know what's going on, monitoring and reporting, even though all these other things are in place in order to prevent things from entering your water system, we still do monitoring and reporting to check in to make sure that all these other systems are working. And then when something is in the water system which could affect public health, we do public notification so that then also the people who are the consumers can also make decisions about how they're going to protect their health as well. Special purpose investigations and find and fix philosophy allows us to go in and really focus on whatever the problem is so that we can solve it. Having this multiple barriers approach means that sometimes it may feel like we have a lot of different things in order to try to solve the problem of keeping our water system safe and reliable. We have this same sort of situation when it comes to climate change. Because, when we have these multiple barriers, the whole point is to manage risk and severity of problems that happen in our water systems. Climate change is altering what we have presumed in the past to be our risk and severity for different types of events. So we have to make sure that we look at each asset that we own to consider how they may be exposed to different or larger vulnerabilities. We have to consider that emergencies may cause different kinds of losses, or they may happen more often. We may have to have stronger water shortage responses so that the public can change their short-term water use in order to prevent things from getting worse. We may need to engage in more effective water use efficiency measures. And then ultimately, if these operational changes aren't sufficient to mitigate our risk, we may also have to go on to changing our capital requirements and our financial need in order to fund those capital changes. Depicted as a flow chart, this is our existing process now. We detect what kind of problems we might have, we prepare for them, and then we implement when that problem comes up. These are our multiple barriers, right? We do an asset inventory to make sure that we understand how our water system actually works. We do a vulnerability assessment to determine whether those assets are exposed to something that climate change may affect. We prepare by having emergency response plans, water shortage response plans, and water use efficiency plans. And then we implement when there's a capital impact that we can accommodate by adding things to our capital facilities plans and then doing a financial plan. Now, I'm not going to talk very much about detecting and implementing right now. I think those are topics that we're very accustomed to dealing with. It's the preparation part that I want to take a look at to demonstrate again that we already have these tools in place. We just have to think of them in a slightly different way. So
we lost you.
Did we lose Brian there?
It seems like it.
Mhm. Yeah, maybe, I don't know.
I think the slides are still working.
No, we maybe send a quick message to maybe
I
Brian.
think he's back.
am I here?
Oh, we gotcha. Yes, you're back.
Yeah, now it's telling, after it's over, it says my internet connection is unstable.
So I think we were just I think we got you on maybe just one slide before this was where you cut out. Right there is where we lost you.
So yeah, in this case, these are links so that if you get a hold of these slides, you'll be able to link to these 3 documents: emergency response planning guide, preparing water shortage response plans, and the water use efficiency guidebook. If you think of these as your multiple barriers, against harm from climate changes, then you'll see that they all fit together in a way. Our emergency response plans. Think about what it is that they're supposed to do. They coordinate people inside your water system and how the, whose job is to do what during the emergency. Who's going to speak for the water system? Who's going to go out there and try to detect what the problem is? Who's going to connect up with the Department of Health? Who's going to connect up with the public? That sort of thing. But that's managing the water system activities once the emergency has already occurred. This is your emergency response, as in this is your EMT, right? This is after the problem has already manifested itself and, the ambulance is on the way. If we want to prevent emergencies from happening, you have to focus on your water shortage response plan. Water shortage response plans are supposed to prevent those emergencies by influencing short-term consumer activities. That is, what is it that your consumers can do which will change the outcome? That is, maybe we can prevent that emergency by your customers using less water. For instance, maybe you stop outdoor irrigation in order to preserve what water is available in your reservoir, that sort of thing. The emergency response is always reactive. It doesn't happen until after the emergency has already started, but water shortage response plans are a barrier to that. That is, they can prevent an emergency by being responsive to the current circumstances of your water system. And even further back, you can use a water use efficiency program to prevent your water system from being fragile in the first place. They can prevent water shortages because whatever water your customers use on a regular basis, if they use less, then whatever they don't use is available during emergency situations. It makes it easier for them to respond to water shortages or potentially prevent them altogether. What you're going to hear later on is that while climate change is definitely changing how the environment is, it changes how the environment works, right? It also changes how your customers work. It changes their habits as well, and is potentially the bigger part of it. So if we can affect the consumer's behavior when it comes to long-term water habits, then it helps counteract the long-term impacts of climate change on our communities. But ultimately is the only way to be proactive. These are the rules of the road. Whereas, the emergency response is the ambulance, water use efficiency are the rules of the road and driver education and that sort of thing.
Just a quick 1-minute warning, Brian.
Fortunately, this is the last slide. What I'm going to ask you to do today is during each of these sessions, think about your assets vulnerabilities and what kind of operational changes you would have to make and integrate them into these 3 documents that you already have. Remember that you have these tools, right? Go ahead and just just go through each one of them and think, what if this was slightly worse than it would have been in the past? What if this is a new kind of thing that we're going to experience? And you're not alone. Water systems throughout the state are thinking about this. People who own infrastructure of all kinds. And of course, we're here to help guide you. Remind people that emergencies are expensive, right? Prevention in the long term saves money. If you don't have to replace a pipe that's been washed away because of a flood, then you not only will have avoided the emergency, but you will have been hardened and you wouldn't have experienced the cost of doing something emergently rather than being able to plan and make it work out for you. Ultimately, one of the things that I want to emphasize is this. What I've been impressed by in the water industry is that we are a lot of very reliable people. We want people to be able to count on us, to be able to do our job, to get in there, do what's necessary, and keep people safe and make sure that our water systems are reliable. In fact, we want our water systems to be at least as reliable as we are, because this is our reputation as an industry, is that we are utterly reliable, even and especially during an emergency. The last thing anybody wants is for the toilets to stop working when there's something else, some other emergency going on in their lives. And so that's why we have to be the most reliable out of all of us. I know you can do it. We've shown it over the last century. Now's the time to be able to show that we can do this. And that's what I have today. Thank you.
Going to be talking a little bit about an overview of historical drought in Washington. So just jumping right in, this was a study that was done almost more than a decade ago at this point, identifying different types of drought or flavors of drought in Washington state using historical data. So this plot on the right is lifted from a paper that we published on this, and it's for Washington and Oregon. So Oregon changes the picture a little bit when you consider it together with Washington, but I'll just speak to the Washington part. So this is precipitation here on our y-axis, and then the water year on the x-axis here. This big bold line is the mean precipitation for the long-term record at that point when that paper came out in 2010. And then these are some precipitation traces averaged over Washington and Oregon for a few examples of droughts. And so the first one, which I think many people think of was when they hear drought, is just a lack of precipitation, a dry winter. So here in Washington state, you all know that winter is our wet season. So this is an example would be a big drought in 1976 and 1977. 2001 was another one where, and this is this hashed line here, where we just had a really dry winter, so it impacted our snowpack. There's kind of some new terminology. Some scientists now call this a dry snow drought. So you might hear it referred to that as well. And then another one is a warm winter type drought. And so this plot here is shown in 2005. And it actually is a little bit dry here too. And that was mostly in Oregon. So Washington had a pretty near normal precipitation winter in 2005. But what was unusual is that the temperatures were warmer than normal. And so that impacted our snowpack, because instead of snow, our precipitation fell as rain. So also a newer terminology sometimes calls these a warm snow drought now. So we have a dry snow drought and a warm snow drought. So different mechanisms for impacting our snowpack. The big example here is 2015. So after this paper came out, we saw a textbook example of this warm winter type drought in 2015. And then another one is our dry summer type drought. So the example we used here is 2003. So we had pretty normal to above normal precipitation in the winter. Things were looking good in the spring, and then just drier summer than even our normally dry summers here. We can see in this kind of hashed line, so much below the mean there. And then in the question mark, so would I classify 2021 as a dry summer type drought? So this is another way, and I'll get back to that. So this is another way of looking at historical droughts in Washington state. On our left-hand side, these are temperature anomalies. So the difference from, I believe this is, the 20th century mean is this kind of straight line here. So then all the reds are above normal temperatures, the blues are below. And then likewise for precipitation, the kind of brownish color is below normal precipitation and the green is above. So 1977 is a classic kind of dry winter or dry snow drought type of drought, where we just had so much less precipitation than usual during the winter. Same thing in 2021. And temperatures not playing as big of a role there. I mentioned 2015, you can see here the temperatures were much above normal for almost the entire water year. The year annually actually ranks as our warmest year on record for Washington state since records began in 1895. So it was nearly 4 degrees Fahrenheit above the 20th century average for the calendar year of 2015. And shown here for Washington, precipitation was a bit on the dry side during our big snowpack building months, but it really wouldn't have been that big a deal if it was cooler and that fell as snow. So it was really driven by those temperatures and resulting in our low snowpack. So 2021 is another a different sort of drought in that, whoops, go back. We had above normal temperatures here in the summer. You can see our record heat wave, June and July, much above normal averaged across the state as a whole. But what really drove this drought here is just this drier than usual spring and summer here. So from March through August, just a really, really dry period in Washington state. So as the drought was unfolding last year, I was asking myself, is this a dry summer type flavor of drought? Going back to some of the original research we did in 2003, the dry conditions that caused that dry summer drought really began in May and persisted through September, but it followed a wet March and April. So that's much different than what we saw in 2021. Here on the right-hand side, these are stream flow rankings for June through September of 2003, showing record low stream flows in Western Washington and Northwest Oregon for that summer type drought at the time, of course, compared to the data that were available then. But how this really differed from what we saw in 2021 is, I already showed my cards a little bit here by just how dry the 2021 spring was. So that was really key. So here is 2021. It was the second driest March, April, May on record for Washington state, going back all the way to 1895. And for me, I think a warm spring and the contribution to a faster snowmelt has always been on my radar in terms of watching that for drought development. But I had personally underappreciated how much a dry spring could impact and deteriorate conditions. And then, of course, for 2021, the dry spring was followed by a record warm summer, the second warmest June through August in Washington state in our recorded history, which really compounded the impacts, which for the 2021 drought were mainly for dryland agriculture and made our drought situation worse. So that's a bit of an aside in terms of what happened in 2021. So we got a lot of questions at our office, like, 2021 spring was super dry. We've had some recent other dry springs. So is that what we should expect with climate change? And it actually is not necessarily, and we have not seen that in our historical trends either. So this is a tool on our website where you can look at station data. So each one of these dots on the map are long-term weather stations. And the big circles mean, and you can select the year range for the trend you want to look at. So I'm looking at spring precipitation. And so any of these larger circles are statistically significant increasing trend in spring precipitation. So you can see that overall throughout the Northwest, we've mostly had wetter springs aside from these recent years. And this doesn't even include 2021 on here yet. It would be down here somewhere. But overall, the long-term trend has been about a 2% change in spring precipitation per decade. Did that slide change? I'm not seeing it change on my side.
No, it didn't change.
Oh, weird.
Oh, there.
On this side, there it is.
Okay, here we go. Summer precipitation is what I see now. So then also looking at summer precipitation, that we do expect to see drier summers in a warming climate, but that signal also hasn't really emerged yet in the Pacific Northwest. This is looking at long-term trends in summer precipitation, June, July, August. All these small circles means that it's not a statistically significant trend. Some are getting wetter, some are getting drier. And then I did want to note, if you look at the recent decades, like if I were to start this trend in the 1950s or 1970s, you can see on this part of the graph here that you would start to see a decrease in summer precipitation. So depending on where you kind of slice those trends, there's been some recent change, but looking at a long-term trend, there hasn't been a change there. Okay, so then how do we look at drought in terms of a time series? This is actually much harder because I just spent this whole time explaining how there's different flavors of drought and different types of drought. So one product that you're probably familiar with is the US Drought Monitor. This is a map for the entire continental US that comes out weekly, and it tries to summarize all of our different drought indicators into one picture of drought for a particular location. So it started in 2000. This is the time series for Washington. And I don't see any trend here. It's pretty short to start claiming that there's a trend. I did want to make a note on what these categories mean. So they're really based on the percentiles of the drought indicator. So D3, for example, or extreme drought would be a drought that you would expect to see about once every 20 to 50 years, and indicators are kind of in the lower third to fifth percentiles. Exceptional drought would be the driest percentile. So in 2021, that was actually the first year since the drought monitor began in 2000 that we had any exceptional drought in Washington state. And that was driven by the extremely low soil moisture and our record dry precipitation. But then going further back, so this is just one example of a drought indicator here. This is the standardized precipitation evapotranspiration index annually for Washington state going all the way back to 1900. And again, I don't see a trend here at all. We've had some drier periods in terms of this index in the 30s and 40s. And then also recently, this includes temperature because it has a potential evapotranspiration estimation that can identify trends due to a warming climate, but have not seen those emerge there yet in that indicator. But how do we expect drought to change? Crystal touched on this already, but just to reiterate, the warm temperatures are really what appears to be the main driver of expected changes in drought. And that is something that we're certain will continue into the future. So warmer temperatures that increase demand, warmer temperatures causing precipitation to fall as rain instead of snow in the mountains, warmer temperatures melting snowpack faster in the spring, those sorts of examples. Multi-year drought is a bit of a hot topic now in the drought research world. We're seeing multi-year drought in the Southwest US, Oregon, Southern Idaho are in a multi-year drought now. In terms of seeing that in the future, one analysis anyway, one study showed that there was a higher likelihood in the future of having back-to-back really warm years, which seems sort of obvious, but the back-to-back dry years, at least for Washington state, didn't appear to be more likely in a changing climate. This over here is looking into the 2040s through 2069 for a high emission scenario. So this means that we're just keep emitting greenhouse gases at the same rate that we currently are. And this is showing the mean return intervals of low snowfall years. So showing that those low snowfall years through the Washington Cascades are expected to become much more common by this period every 1 to 2 years. Which is not great news in terms of what we expect for our snowpack. Okay. There we go. So I did want to reiterate again that 2015 type drought is really what we expect to see in the future. This is a complicated plot, so bear with me. It's for the whole Pacific Northwest. Each one of these small dots is a historical October through February temperature, and then October through February precipitation. So this dot is what happened in 2015 for the winter of 2015. This is 1934, another historically really warm year in the Pacific Northwest. And then each one of these bolder dots, these are all climate models. So models of what our expected future will be. This is by the 2040 to 2069. And then this square is our average, the model average. So this is just showing that the 2015 type of drought, which was driven by those really warm seasonal winter temperatures, is expected to become more normal by the 2050s based on these model scenarios. Sorry again for the delay in slides. Okay, So here we are. So Washington Drought Declaration, you're probably mostly familiar with this, but in talking about drought definitions, Washington State actually has a definition of drought written in statute. So it's when water supply conditions are below or expected to fall below 75% of normal. And there is also a potential for undue hardships due to low water supply. So there's two kind of criteria that have to be met for ecology and the governor to declare a drought declaration. So there's two committees that assess these conditions. So the Water Supply Availability Committee determines the actual weather and climate conditions. So I'm a part of that committee. And then there's the EWEC, an emergency committee that determines the hardship piece. So does it matter that it's this dry in this particular region? And then in 2021, a new and so that's for a drought emergency. But in 2021, the state had a new capability of declaring a drought advisory. And so that is to promote early awareness of drought conditions that might be developing. So that did occur in May of 2021. And in July, a drought emergency was declared. And so the reason why there's this hole here in Western Washington is because the hardship piece wasn't really there. So the bigger water systems in these areas were not going to have any issues with their water supply. So they were excluded from the drought declaration. There were a few counties declared or watersheds declared in drought in 2019. And then 2015 was a complete statewide drought declaration.
Just
Okay,
a quick 1 minute warning as well.
Okay, I'm almost done. So I will go quickly through here. So this is, I think the main point to make here, this is the map of the drought. Okay. So the key piece is once an emergency is declared, there is then usually emergency funding that becomes available for people to apply to. The bulk of these drought permits are used for irrigation purposes. Drinking water permits are pretty rare. So this is all the number of the drought permits that were issued by Ecology from 1994 to 2021. And let's see, the other part of drought emergency funding is that there's also grant funding in addition to the drought permits. Now the grant funding is more likely to be used for water systems. In fact, drinking water systems make up the bulk of applications for emergency drought funding. So that's an indication that the challenge is less water rights than infrastructure. So this is an example of some drought funding projects that were approved in 2015. And then I think I have one more slide here. So the other good news on the grant funding is that new drought legislation passed in 2020 so that there's now the ability to fund projects that aren't strictly emergency projects. And now the state can fund building long-term resiliency in these when the drought emergencies are declared. Unfortunately, there wasn't any money in 2020 or 2021 for that, but hopefully that will change with new legislation. So just to summarize, the Washington drought during water year 2021 was unique in that it was a dry spring followed by a warm summer. That was the cause of drought conditions after, and I don't think I said this, but I meant to, we had a very normal April 1 snowpack in 2021. While there are significant warming temperature trends throughout Washington, little can be said for the trend in drought occurrence so far. And we expect to see more droughts in the future driven by continuation of warmer temperatures. The 2015 drought, the warm snowpack type drought, is the type of drought we expect to see more of. So I'll close there.
And groundwater quality. So I understand that there are a number of water systems that depend on groundwater, which is, I think, why we're having a specific session on that topic. So I wanted to start with a very high level overview of groundwater. It's underground. We don't see it, so we don't think about it a lot. But it is an interconnected resource. So all of the surface waters that we see communicate and are connected to groundwater. Groundwater enters the ground through infiltration, so snow melting and that water moving into the ground, rain falling on to the surface and that water infiltrating into the ground. Sometimes that water runs off directly into surface water, but a large portion of that flows into the ground and becomes our groundwater resource. So when we pump on groundwater, where is that water actually coming from? I think it's important to realize that, as stated here, Tice was a famous hydrogeologist. All water discharged by wells is balanced by a loss of water for somewhere else. So again, because this water is underground and we don't see it, I think sometimes we think of it as this kind of resource that we can tap into without recognizing that indeed, you know, if we're tapping into that water, that means that that water is not going to make it somewhere else into the environment. So we can remove water out of aquifer storage. And so I have just this cartoon here kind of showing an island sitting in a lake. This would be the pre-pumping condition, and then what things might look like after you start pumping. So storage is this water that had been sitting in the underground matrix that we've then essentially mined out of the subsurface. So that water is gone after we pull it out. We can also capture natural recharge. So in this pumping situation here, this well, after mining out the water that was sitting in the matrix, it's now capturing rain that's falling onto the landscape. So all this rainfall initially had flown into this island and then out to the lake. Our well is now capturing that rainfall. We can also reduce or capture what would be natural discharge. So again, we had rain coming in and that water was flowing out to a lake, flowing out to the lake. So that water was discharging. So we're now capturing that discharge. So that water is no longer coming out into the lake. Instead, it's going into our well. And then we can also start pulling in water from nearby surface water bodies. So again, in this situation, our lake used to receive water from this island, and then after pumping, the lake is now supplying water to the island. So this is just to illustrate the kind of interconnected nature of many surface water, groundwater resources. Of course, you can move into a situation where then we have reduced rainfall, and then it might be hard to see in this cartoon, but the lake level has dropped, right? So perhaps we have a drought and our surface waters decline. That in turn can have an impact on our well. So in this case, what I'm showing is that the well has gone dry because of this reduction in lake water level. Okay, so that kind of primer about groundwater and where the water that we're getting is coming from, let's move in and think about climate impacts. So thinking just about groundwater supply, what the research is showing is that, you know, the expected changes to the climate are going to have a minor direct impact on groundwater recharge and storage. So Crystal talked about how we're expecting snow to shift into rain. And the timing of that recharge is going to shift. So that means that the water entering into the groundwater, the timing of that is changing. But what we're seeing is that the annual recharge volumes aren't going to change dramatically. So basically, the rain is still going to be able to make its way into the aquifer instead of the snow. And ultimately for groundwater, it's the annual recharge, not the seasonal, that matters. So that's the direct impact of climate change. But how humans are going to respond to climate change is likely going to have a very big impact on our groundwater supply. So it's not that recharge is fundamentally going to shift because of the climate. It's how humans are going to respond to those changes and how we manage our water resources that's going to have the biggest impact on our groundwater supply. So it's expected that there's going to be an increased demand for groundwater as we move into the future. And that's going to lead to reduced water tables. So this is in part to something we're already facing, right, which is this growth in state human population. But now we couple onto that we're going to be likely seeing reductions in surface water supply increases in irrigation demand and sustained summer drought. So that means that our surface water supply, which is very sensitive to climate, will probably shift some of that into our groundwater. There is going to probably be a very big impact because of how we're choosing to manage and use our groundwater resources. This is just a report that went out from the USGS. This is the Columbia Plateau Regional Aquifer System. And so basically they modeled this aquifer system, and we're looking at groundwater levels. This was historic to 2007, around the time when the report came out. And so what we can see is that, you know, in places like the Columbia Plateau, where, you know, it's relatively dry, we've already seen drops in groundwater levels. So that's this orange color in here. So this is our use of groundwater is causing declines in the groundwater level. We do see places where groundwater levels have increased, and that's basically due to irrigation and that return flow coming in from irrigation. So we can see we've already had an impact on our groundwater system because of how we're using groundwater. And then in this study, they thought about what about moving into the future? And so this is projected groundwater declines in this same region. And I think what's interesting to note with this is that, you know, they're predicting declines throughout here. And this is simply due to kind of 2007 water availability and use constraints. So this has no projection about kind of future increases in demand. So kind of our current moving forward with you know, business as usual, we're going to continue to be declining this groundwater level. And then you can layer onto that kind of increased demand for groundwater, and it's likely going to exacerbate this situation. So the summary is that, you know, we're not expecting climate to really change groundwater recharge, but this human response to climate change is going to have a big impact on our groundwater supplies. And I think we can expect demand to increase and that to lead to reduced water tables. So what about the quality of our groundwater? We know that quantity is only one part of the equation. As water treatment systems, you care about both the quantity and the quality. So if we think about groundwater contamination, there are basically kind of two classes. So we have geologic sources of contamination. So this is contamination that exists within the geologic matrix and the soils and the sediments, and that can get mobilized into the surrounding water. So arsenic, which I'm showing here, is an example of a geologic contaminant. We also can have human sources of contamination that largely get flushed in through the land surface and with water being recharged into the aquifer. Again, the USGS, they did a really nice study looking kind of nationally here in the US at major aquifer systems and, you know, looking at contamination within those aquifer systems. Green is showing geologic sources of contamination. So you can see that throughout the US, lots of geologic concerns. And then also in pink is this human source of contamination. Up here in the Columbia Plateau Basin, we have a big chunk of contamination coming from human sources. So both types of contamination matter. So what are the expected impacts of climate change on our groundwater quality? It is very uncertain. Just as an example, thinking about surface contamination, we know that if we kind of alter the transport of recharge, then we can change then the transport of contamination into the aquifer. So one possible climate impact is increased storm intensity. People have said, well, that's going to flush more of, say, like soil nitrate, which is sitting in surface soils, down into our water table. That's one possible. outcome. The other though is like, well, we're having so much storm intensity, we're going to just exceed the soil infiltration capacity. So now more of that water is going to run off and not enter into our groundwater table. So then that would end up reducing soil nitrate. So, you know, we have something that could increase and something that could decrease nitrate within aquifers. You know, another situation is that, you know, we moving forward in the climate, we're going to have expect, you know, these warmer temperatures. So we're going to have increased plant growth, increased ET demand. And so if we're thinking about kind of agriculture, this could lead to basically more water getting transpired by the agricultural crops, and then less of that water returning down into the aquifer. And so that could lead to less chemical leaching into the groundwater. But you could also envision a situation where we end up saying, we have this great weather for growing things, so we're going to increase our planting and our harvest cycles. And so that in turn will increase irrigation, fertilizer, pesticide application, and increase chemical leaching. So we have, again, things kind of moving in opposite directions. And then, of course, if we increase groundwater pumping, we have the potential to pull surface water into our system. And if that water is contaminated, we could then be pulling in that water as well. So a lot of uncertainty. That's with the surface sources of contamination, the human sources. What about the geologic contamination? Well, we expect groundwater temperatures to get warmer over time as the temperature of that water entering into the aquifer gets warmer over time into the future. And we know that this process of mobilizing a geologic contamination off of soil and sediments and into water, often this is a microbially mediated process, and microbial kinetics get faster as temperatures get warmer. So there is the possibility that as we have kind of warmer conditions within the subsurface, we might be mobilizing more geologic contaminants. Another possibility is that with this increased water demand and potentially declining groundwater levels, we'll end up needing to deepen our existing wells or drilling new wells down to deeper depths or new locations. In general, deeper groundwater is usually older than shallower groundwater. So that means that water has had more contact and time interacting with the geologic matrix, which can lead to more mineral content or geologic contamination. I was able to access some historic data from, this is raw water quality data, nitrate concentrations within raw water for a number of operating systems around the state. And I just was interested in trying to look at how are concentrations of nitrate potentially changing over time. And perhaps not surprising given what I just presented, you know, within the same counties, you know, I was seeing nitrate is increasing over time in one well, but maybe decreasing over time in another well. So the same trend here, an increase in one well and a decrease in the other, an increase in one well and a decrease in the other. So the summary here is that the impacts of climate change on groundwater quality are very uncertain. And I think ultimately what it's going to come down to is the local conditions around that supply well and the kind of local context and kind of the human actions and choices that are happening around that local situation is really going to be what dictates how water quality changes within kind of your system if you're depending on groundwater. But kind of the key takeaway that I wanted to leave everyone with is that groundwater quantity and quality ultimately are more sensitive to how we as humans respond to climate change than to the direct effects of climate change. So climate change operating without humans would have a relatively small impact on our groundwater quantity and groundwater quality. But you layer in humans into this equation and we are going to be having a big impact on our groundwater systems. But I think kind of leaving with a hopeful message, and maybe this is one I've heard repeated in other presentations, is that because it's how we're going to respond, that means it's not out of our control. So we can have smart and integrated management of our surface water resources and our groundwater resources. And collectively that can help protect water quality and quantity within our systems in our state.
My name is Erica Sinas. I am a research scientist with the Climate Impacts Group. My background is in city and regional planning. I'm a planner by training, but I also am a social scientist that is focused on climate adaptation. And so next slide. Yeah, so today I'm going to talk about 3 things. So first is sort of the findings that we've had from this systematic review of water system plans and case studies and lessons learned from that. So, the first question is really, who is incorporating climate change into their water system plans? And the second is how they're doing it. And then just some best practices on how we can manage uncertainty in resilience planning. Next slide. Okay, so who is considering climate change in their water system plans? Next. So just to give a bit of context, we are doing this workshop to help water systems begin thinking about how they could adapt to climate impacts. But in addition to that, we also did this systematic review and research based on water system plans because we wanted to know who is already doing it, how they were doing it, and to see if there could be any lessons learned that could be applied to smaller utilities. And so the scope of this work is active Group A community systems with over 1,000 service connections. And part of this is because there is a requirement for them to develop water system plans. Also, there was a Senate bill that was introduced in the previous legislative session by Senator Ruffles, which would require public water systems serving over 1,000 service connections to include a climate resilience element as part of the water system plan. And so, that was just a bit of background of why we wanted to look into this. And this is just a visual of where those water systems are and kind of the size of those connections. So if you could look in the total service connections, the average size is about 9,600 service connections. But there's also this big jump from those who have 11,000 to 170,000 service connections, meaning there's just this very small group of really large water systems in the state. And most of these systems are publicly owned and operated. So you can see city ownership, city town. Next. And so not within the scope of our research are those smaller water systems with less than 1,000 service connections, but part of this work is really, we hope that we could identify those lessons learned on how those other water systems are incorporating climate into their planning and see how those could be applied to other utilities given their own sort of operational, managerial, and technical challenges. Next. And so the method for this research is that we looked at all the Group A water systems, and we couldn't look at all 235 water systems. And so part of that was creating this representative sample, so a subset of all the plans that would accurately reflect the characteristics of this larger group. And so one caveat is that we excluded federal, county, and state owned and operated utilities from this research. And we only looked at 15% of that total, which was 36 water system plans. And we looked at them by region and by size. And by size, we were looking at sort of the max total population that they were serving. So the smallest percentile was less than 5,000, and then the middle percentile was 5,000 to 25,000. And the largest were those systems serving over 25,000 people. Next. And so our method for this wasn't as simple, was climate change in the water system plan or not? It wasn't a simple yes or no, but we looked at the extent to which climate change was covered. So did they acknowledge that it was occurring, but not more than that? Or did they understand the impacts of their supply, but maybe didn't really do a more in-depth assessment of what their vulnerabilities were? Did they, and then assess is, did they do some sort of vulnerability assessment specific to their water system? And then next is, did they plan for it? And last is if they implemented any sort of adaptation or resilience actions in response to what they had found. And so this is one of our initial findings. So this is climate change by size, so how much they incorporated climate change based on the sizes of the water systems. And so even though there's this range of water systems above 1,000 service connections, it was really just those really large water systems serving over 25,000 max total population that were implementing climate change actions and doing some sort of planning for it. We see a little bit of that in these mid-sized systems in that range, but really, the key message here is that only the really, really large ones are doing it, even within those, even in that range of people who are required to develop water systems. So next. And so this is just what that distribution looks like for based on region. So it's more or less the same. There's just a few people, maybe less than 25% for each group, that are implementing climate actions. Next. And we did the same level assessment for how they were incorporating drought. And so this is again by size. Sorry if it's a little bit small, but interestingly, we didn't see as much implementation in those mid-sized systems, but in those large systems, we saw a lot of drought response actions. And similarly for those very small water systems that were less than 5,000, that were serving less than 5,000 people. Next. Is that the correct slide? Okay, and this is that same analysis, except this is for drought by region. And so we can see that in Eastern Washington, in those plans that we analyzed, we saw sort of a lot of acknowledgement of drought, but not so much direct plans or implementation of response actions. In the Northwest, we saw a lot of implementation and response actions to drought. And then in the Southwest, about half of them were planning or implementing for drought. And this is not for all the water system plans, but for those that were assessing, planning, and implementing some sort of drought climate change response. 61% of them were related to climate change. Next. And so some caveats, we were only able to look at publicly available plans, which could impact the findings. The analysis is still ongoing, so we're also looking at other impacts such as flooding, wildfire, and resilience actions for water quality. And this is only an assessment of how climate is being used in existing water system plans, right? Climate resilience can happen outside of these plans, and these plans are only updated every 10 years. And it's also good for us to be responsive, right? What we know about climate change is always evolving. And so, in a plan that gets updated every 10 years, that might not always be in there. And so those were just some of the limitations of this research. Next. And so how is climate change being incorporated into water system planning? So I'm just pulling out this one example from Everett. Next slide. So Everett's water supply is from the Salton River Basin, and it starts at Spada Reservoir, which captures runoff from rainfall and snowmelt. And so their question for their surface water supply was that, would the water system have enough supply to meet 2015 and 2035 forecasted demand levels under severe drought? Next. And so part of this is that they developed several scenarios to kind of test how their water system supply would respond to drought. And so they used sort of this 1987 drought, which was the worst drought on record, as sort of this baseline, right? This was the worst thing that happened. And just to kind of give context in comparison to the 2015 drought, they did this analysis in 2015, but they still chose to use this 1987 drought because of the differences in conditions. In 1987, it was a summer and fall drought with low precipitation and extremely low stream flows until December. But in 2015, there were heavy rains that returned by October that ended the drought. So kind of in the long term, that 87 drought was worse, which is why they used this baseline. And then, they kind of looked at what an extended historical drought would look like and what an extreme drought would look like. And I think, one of the key lessons here, it is a really huge water system, right? And Karen showed that example, and this is one of the water systems that was exempt from the drought emergency declaration last year. But I think what is important here is really sort of that process of trying to imagine what that future scenario is and preparing for it, trying to identify that threshold, kind of going back to that first activity that we went to. And so, this extended historical drought scenario, they looked at what would happen if drought increased in frequency. What would a multi-year drought look like? What would happen if it happened 2 years in a row? And they ended up actually not using this scenario because they felt that they saw that supply conditions would be similar if it occurred in another year, and that they would recover in the winter. And so a multi-year drought was not that relevant to them. But then they looked at this extreme drought scenario where what would happen if it increased in severity. So they increased the severity by reducing the reservoir inflow from that 1987 scenario to a point where they couldn't meet demand. Next slide. And basically under these two scenarios, they found that, for 2015 and 2035, those were the two demand forecast years that they were looking at, through in-stream flow reductions and voluntary curtailment measures, they would be resilient to extreme drought conditions. But again, I really wanted to point out sort of like the process that they took to understand what it would take for them to be resilient to that. And I guess some few details here that I want to point out, right? Each geographic supply region is expected to share similar negative effects due to their close proximity. And so Everett chose to use information from Seattle about their supply, since they are the closest neighbors and they would experience similar climatic and weather conditions. Which brings me to my next point. And so this study, they actually didn't do this alone. This was done by the Water Supply Forum, and they did this for Seattle, Tacoma, and Everett. And so this just shows sort of the opportunities that collaboration could bring, because they did this risk assessment together. And also one of the findings was that under this extreme drought scenario, SPU and Tacoma Water wouldn't be able to meet their demands. And so there was a potential for Everett to be able to provide that drought relief through an emergency intertie with these two other systems. Next. And I guess the lessons learned from there is that, applied to small to medium water systems, you don't always need to have new models or data, right? Existing regional climate data already exists and can be a good starting point for understanding how you can assess climate impacts to your system. And that regional data is there, and in the workshop materials, there's also sources to climate data that you can use, right? And if your neighboring system has that information, it's good to look it over and see what could apply to your system. And I guess the other lesson there is that past events can also help us better envision and prepare for the future. And so for that example, right, they had that 1987 drought, and some of the adjustments to understand what the future impacts would be was that this is the worst thing that happened to us. What if it just happened more often or for longer or more intensely? And so there's a use to understanding our response to those past events. Second lesson is put climate change into context, right? Just because a multi-year drought is happening doesn't mean you're sensitive to it. And so you are the expert on your water system, and the impact, sensitivities, and resilience needs are really dependent on you and what you know is needed for your system. And the last point here is that you don't have to do it alone. Collaborations and partnerships are a key to resilience. And I think that was one of the lessons from, having done this risk assessment, these three systems together, right? Resource sharing can result in shared benefits. Sometimes it gives you access to solutions that you wouldn't necessarily have resources to pursue on your own. It's also this platform to share experiences and lessons and insights amongst your peers, right? The regional impacts that you experience might be the same, and it's good to just have that network of support with other systems who might be experiencing those same impacts. And it's also a way to collaboratively design solutions and create a stronger base for advocacy. So, some solutions may be out of reach today, but if you know what they are early on, you can start advocating for them, and being able to advocate for them together makes your case stronger. Okay, I think I will just end there.
Thanks everyone for having me. My name is Wesley Wiggins. I'm an ORISE fellow with the EPA's Creating Resilient Water Utilities Initiative. So just want to thank you for the opportunity to present on our tools and resources. So I'll just go ahead and get started. Make sure I can some slides. There we go. So clean and safe drinking water is so critical to public and environmental health. It's so important that to accelerate the development of water infrastructure across the U.S. to bolster resilience and readiness to future climate impacts, like extreme temperatures, precipitation, and natural disasters. And so the goal of the Creating Resilient Water Utilities Initiative, or CREW, is to provide drinking water, wastewater, and stormwater utilities with practical and easy to understand tools, training, and technical assistance needed to increase resilience to climate change. All of our tools and resources were developed by input from our water sector partners and promote a clear understanding of regional climate science and potential long-term adaptation options. Another goal of our program is to increase awareness of climate science and adaptation options through a variety of regional workshops and virtual webinars. So now I'm just going to transition into talking about all of the tools that we offer, starting with the Resilient Strategies Guide. So this tool is a free online application that assists water sector utilities in developing adaptation strategies that address utility priorities. Users can provide utility information like system type and geographic region and select critical assets and main priorities in this tool. The RSG, which is the abbreviation, but the RSG provides geographically pre-sorted priorities and assets for utilities to choose from. Then, after selecting those, users can choose from a list of potential strategies as well as potential funding sources to help reduce risk to critical assets based on previous inputs and selections. The final report from this tool also is printed out at the end of the tool once you're done, and containing all of the different strategies you selected, and also a link to our case studies tool, which I'll talk about later, so you can see what other utilities have done doing with similar threats and concerns and projects. So this tool, it takes between 5 to 10 minutes to complete, but it also really depends on how much time you want to invest in it. So it's a perfect tool for utilities who are maybe new to understanding climate impacts or don't have the time to spare for a full climate change risk assessment. So this is one of our tools to help utilities understand kind of individual, or I should say regional or local climate impacts. We also have other tools to help you explore more climate data that are all in kind of geographic form. So we have a number of maps, both current maps on our site and also a lot of upcoming maps as well. But I'll just start by talking about our storm surge and inundation map. So this map depicts the potential for flooding in coastal areas based on hurricane surge models and FEMA flood zones. This information can then be used to identify the potential for hurricane landfall and coastal flooding when assessing flood risk and planning for mitigating flood damage in the event of a storm. Our next map is the climate scenarios projections map. So this map provides easy access climate scenario-based climate change projections that is drawn from one of our other tools, which I'll talk about after this. But this includes various impacts from changing climate, including, as you see over here on the slide, extreme heat, but also changes in temperature, precipitations, storm events, sea level, so all sorts of different information related to climate, and all information that can help utilities deal with challenges and help the communities that they serve. So because understanding how climate change affects that utility's ability to maintain and deliver adequate, reliable, and sustainable water supplies and clean water services is always the first step in understanding any climate-related planning. Finally, the maps that we currently have on our site is the stream flow projections map. So this map displays projections for possible changes in flow conditions for U.S. streams and rivers under a range of environmental conditions. These changes in the stream flow changes in the stream flow present a real challenge to water sector utilities and the communities that they serve. So considering how these flows may change will help utilities maintain and deliver adequate, reliable, and sustainable water supplies and clean water services. Recently, we've also added one other layer to this map, which you can see on the screen here, which is the current water availability map. Now, this map helps utilities see current drought conditions, precipitation forecasts, and hazard warnings, as well as the status of U.S. stream gauges and reservoirs. This new map helps utilities. This new map helps utilities implement strategies that mitigate service disruptions from drought and floods by providing access to both current conditions and short-term forecasts, like I said before, for both droughts and flooding. And so in the case that you want to look into doing a more robust climate change risk assessment, we also have a tool for that, and that is our Climate Resilience Evaluation and Awareness tool. It is a first of its kind tool for water utilities. It's a web-based and customizable climate change risk assessment tool. The data from this tool is sourced, it's similar to the tool, the data that we have in our climate projections map, which I talked about in our previous slide as well. So this tool, I'll speak more about what it does. So it guides utilities through 5 modules, which are, as you can see on the screen, climate awareness, scenario development, consequences and assets, adaptation planning, and risk assessment. And these will help walk utilities through identifying regional climate change impacts, consequences to critical assets, existing and future adaptation options, and more. As I said earlier, this tool includes the same climate data as our maps and includes projections through 2 time frames, 2035 and 2060, for data such as temperature, precipitation, sea level rise, extreme weather, extreme heat, and surface water quality. Additionally, the adaptation measures that we discussed, that will be discussed in our adaptation planning module, sorry, let me back up. The adaptation measures provided in the tool includes cost data based on market research. The results from CREATE will help utilities compare the monetized risk reduction from implementing new adaptation options with the estimated costs to implement them, which will help support cost-effective investments. Our tool is kind of our flagship product, so it's been around for around 10, 11 years, as long as we've been around. So we've worked with quite a number of different utilities, and you can see all of their different success stories available on our case study and information exchange map. It was developed to help utilities connect with their peer utilities and share their resilience building experiences and learn best practices. So this map is interactive, so you can explore case studies across the United States through different threats as well. So you can see on the side of on the screen here, drought, flood, ecosystem changes, service reliability, and water quality are kind of how you can filter through different case studies. And so each of the case studies, if you click on any of the icons that you see here, I have Seattle Public Utilities pulled up here. But if you click on that, read more information, you get to actually see a full case study detailing some background about the utility, the challenges they face, and how they worked with us to use the CREATE tool to develop a risk assessment and implement adaptation options. Currently, we have over 57 Create success stories available on our map. And as Crew continues to work with more utilities, that case studies map will only continue to grow. So if you are interested in learning more about what we have to offer, we have several ways to get more information about Crew tools and resources. And one of those ways is through our upcoming trainings and workshops. And so Crew, we offer both webinars, workshop series, but also direct technical assistance to utilities. And so we conduct, as I said, we conduct direct technical assistance with several utilities across the US. And we also give an option of once these direct exercise sessions are concluded, utilities can work with us to conduct a virtual webinar to help connect you with local and federal partners to help you implement the adaptation plans, and also kind of help other utilities in your area learn about Create as well. We also offer five session regional workshops through, as you can see, all the different climate regions on this map to the right here. And we actually have a upcoming workshop in the Northwest region, which includes Washington, but also Oregon and Idaho. And so in these Create trainings, it's a free in-depth training series on Create that will help water sector utilities develop their own climate change risk assessment and also identify adaptation strategies to build utility long-term resilience and learn about available resources for financing resilience and adaptation projects. We do offer CEUs or credit hours if you register and attend these training sessions. So just to overview what we provide in each session. In the introductory session, which is on April 20th, we will provide an overview of climate change impacts in the Northwest climate region and provide an overview of Crew tools and resources similar to what I just walked through. And then we'll also present a local case study. And for this workshop, we're working with a utility in Oregon. In the first 3 training sessions, which are on May 3rd, May 5th, and May 10th, we're going to go over Create's 5 modules and then provide an overview of federal and local financial resources. And then after a week break, we're going to pick back up right before Memorial Day on May 24th with the 4th and final session. And this session will actually, first of all, we'll offer a chance for Q&A about any of the last 4 sessions, last 3 sessions, or the introductory session, I should say. And then we're actually going to be providing or hosting a facilitated discussion of how utility can seek funding, and we'll have representation from EPA's SRF, or State Revolving Fund, and WIFIA programs. We also, for all of our workshops, we will actually work with our communications team to get these up and record them on our website. So we, after the fact, can also, you can also go to our website and look up trainings from any of the following regions. They're not all posted yet, but we're working on getting them all posted. So I think that's all from me. But last thing I want to show you is some of our contact information, just so you know how to find us. Easiest way is to go to epa.gov/CRWU.